Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Birgit Kloos, the CEO of The Right Place, and I want to welcome you to and thank all of you for joining us for our next installment of our Navigate 2020 webinar series. The Right Place is now 35 years old and was created during a time that was in Michigan also a difficult time, and we've worked with many of you through numbers of crises, and we're here to continue to help you through this one. While we can't meet in person, which would be great, we have created this webinar series to stay connected with all of you virtually. The webinar is designed really to bring you the expertise and resources, and we do this monthly now, to discuss pressing topics of interest to you and your business, but also to bring you information that you can then use in your business. The topic today is how to find global opportunities during uncertain economic times. And we've put together a terrific panel with experts, and we're joined by Sonja Johnson, who is the Executive Director of the Van Andel Global Trade Center at GVSU and a great partner of The Right Place. She will share her insights with us and then also be the moderator for our panel. And I'm really thrilled with the panelists we have today. John Kennedy, the President and CEO of AutoCam Medical and a Right Place board member. Thank you, John. Jim Tietz, the President and CEO of ADEC Automotive and also a Right Place board member. And Eddie Schmidt, the Senior Vice President for the Americas for Steelcase. Thank you, Eddie, for joining us. They will share with us how they have adapted to the changes in operations, the changes in global supply chains, and thus how to meet their customers' needs in this changing environment. After the panel discussion, there is a time for Q&A, and I'd encourage all of you to put your questions into the comment box. I don't know what's going on with my phone. I apologize. So please, we want your questions, and you can do this anytime during the presentation if you put your comments and your questions in the comments box. With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Sonja Johnson. Sonja, I'm really glad you could join us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to work with the team at The Right Place. So just to kind of give a big overview of what's going on. There's so many different things going on this year in 2020. Some of them more difficult than others, but I just wanted to go through a few quick slides for you. As of May's data for the US, we had a deficit of 54.6 billion. So I'm hoping by the time the next release comes in August, early August, we'll see some improvement on that, meaning that our Michigan businesses and the US businesses are exporting and selling more product outside the US. So this first year was released in a 2019 report by the World Trade Organization. And it just kind of shows you a decade of time span and how world trade merchandise and their volume compares to GDP. It's just kind of interesting to see where the world is at as far as trade. And again, this is global trade, not just one region, for about a 10-year period of time. So you can see that 3% growth on trade volume over that time period. Moving forward, the next slide here shows the impact of free trade agreements across the globe. So these are all global trade agreements that are in place right now. You can see from that darker orange area, those are regional trade agreements. So for the United States, like USMCA or NAFTA as shown on the screen, this data was prior to USMCA coming into place. But you can see from all these different trade agreements around the world, how much is trade within that region and how much is going to outside of that region to the rest of the world. So just wanted to give you a snapshot of that real quick because it kind of gives you some tells of what's going on there. Moving right along, it's really interesting to see what the World Trade Organization has put for priorities. As you'll see here, merchandise exports grew 10% over a 10-year period of time. Some other shining stars are some in the fuels and mining areas that grew 23%, and agriculture products, which are very important to Michigan, grew globally 5%. Another promising area for global trends is looking at the telecommunications. Those grew 15% over the 10-year period. And then also goods and services. It's pretty dynamic to see the growth in services across the globe. And I'm sure a lot of our Michigan businesses are taking advantage of that. But also just looking how the trends are adapting from less merchandise exports and more areas of service. And as far as global value chains, it's really interesting to see how the Asian region is exploding with trade within the region. And I think they're going to be one to watch for global changes over the next 5-10 years. And it really was impressive to me to see that the World Trade Organization is really trying to get their arms around digital trade. And the Van Andel Global Trade Center is working with a lot of businesses that aren't actually shipping goods, but sending technology. And they're doing that digitally via the cloud or transfers once they get the funding from their customers. So it's interesting to see that the World Trade Organization has seen that there's issues with that, and they're trying to get their arms around to start reporting that. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next couple of years of how they're actually able to start measuring that. So with that, it's just kind of a quick overview of what's going on around the world, and real quick in the U.S. I'm sure our U.S. exporters that are joining us today, starting with John Kennedy. Birgit had mentioned President and CEO of AutoCam Medical. So welcome, John. Also, Jim Teets, President and CEO of ADEC Automotive, one of the most challenging industries, I think, during this time. And last but certainly not least, Eddie Schmidt, Senior VP of Americas for Steelcase. So as Eddie joins us here, a really pleasure to have you here with us all. I think we have very diverse industries. I think there's a lot of commonalities in some of the global issues your businesses are running into. And as Birgit said, I think none of our panelists will be offended if you have a question. You just have to jump in and ask. We want it to be as interactive with you. I think the more interaction you have on some of these video content providers, it just helps your business. So ask away the questions, and I'll keep monitoring those in the chat box or the Q&A box. So to get us started, I'd like to pick on Eddie. So Eddie, can you share a couple of the benefits Steelcase has experienced selling your products and services around the world?
There are multiple benefits. The most important one is growth. We've been the market leader in the US for the last 40 plus years. And the US in our industry is fairly consolidated. So if we wanted to find growth, we had to look into places like Europe, Middle East, Latin America, and Asia, which were more fragmented as industry. And we could use our innovation, our scale, to make a difference in those markets. So growth is certainly the key driver for global sales. Over the last few months, one of the big benefits was resilience, because we had the opportunity to learn from COVID and how to respond to COVID from our experience in China, where one day a few months ago, the government showed up and told us we had to shut down, and no exceptions, no whatever, no essential business, you shut down. And we learned a lot from dealing with that kind of disruption, and then in Europe to get prepared here in the Americas. And frankly, our business is more resilient now also because we have operations in Europe and Asia where the business is on the upswing much more than here, where we're still in the middle of the crisis. So as a company, it made us more resilient. If I had to add one last huge benefit, it was innovation. We had lots of great innovation coming from our teams in Europe and Asia that we actually launched in the Americas. And that was a huge advantage for us to have several sources of innovation around the world.
Great, thank you, Eddie. Jim, do you have anything to share from ADEC's perspective?
Yeah, I think, the benefits for us now, we obviously were a smaller company than Steelcase, but so one of the big things that we've learned to do is partner across the world. So we have a global partnership with a German-based company, privately held, and then a publicly traded company out of Milwaukee. But together, we have the partnership owns facilities in China, a joint venture in India, sales and engineering in Korea and Tokyo. And so we've learned how to partner. We also have a joint venture with our publicly traded company Stratec down in Mexico, which really is our answer to the North American LCC. And that partnership, as much as everybody talks about joint ventures are usually a disaster, we have two Midwestern companies, one private, one public, but it's a beautiful partnership. And so probably the main thing is don't be afraid to reach out, search for global partners if you're not of the mass and scale to do it on your own. And ADAC clearly could not have done it on our own.
So for your partnerships and, looking at furthering your product sales, obviously there's got to be some benefits for your partners as well as working with you. It's opened some doors for them, I'm assuming, over time as well.
Yeah, I think for all of us, what it's really done is help solidify our positions at the major OEMs that we're at. So in Vitta's case in Germany, with their biggest customer is Volkswagen. They have helped us tremendously here, but conversely, we've helped them tremendously with Ford, a little bit with FCA in Italy, GM not so much anymore in Europe, obviously, but it's helped all of us gain the size and the mass. Together, we're about 1.7, 1.8 billion in sales and about 12,000 employees, where it's a totally different story, and you have the mass to get the attention of senior executives at the OEMs.
Great, thanks, Jim. John, do you have anything to add for benefits for your team?
Yeah, I think the biggest benefit that we get out of our, our global relationships and having plants in foreign locales like Brazil and China is it allows us to service our customers on a global basis. And if you look at the med device business, it's really a U.S. dominated multinational business. When you look at the major players like Stryker and Zimmer Biomet and et cetera, DePuy, which is J&J, it's really an American multinational dominated business. And so our ability to service them with the same product we manufacture for them in North America, also in China and Brazil, makes us very different than we're not that big. And so, that makes our size looks much bigger to those companies.
That's great. And so how have you seen your competition around the world evolving over the last, let's say, 2 to 3 years pre-COVID period?
Yeah, so in our business is a rapidly consolidating business. It reminds me a little bit of the automotive industry in let's say the 80s. A lot of our competitors, we used to, when I did the original business plan for the med device business in 2005, we probably had 300 or 400 competitors that were of similar size to what we were, $15 to $20 million in sales. Now the top 10, we have companies as big as 500 million, and we're barely in the top 10 at about 150 million. So you've seen that rapid consolidation occurring really around the world as they try to compete in the contract manufacturing business to service the customers.
So either Eddie or Jim, if you want to try to jump in here, as far as commodity pricing and the competitive need to actually produce the goods that you guys are producing, how has that changed over the last 2 to 3 years? If you think back, the trade war with China started in 2018. The aluminum steel war was March of 2018 with a few exceptions. How has that impacted your business and your operations?
Yeah, automotive supplier margins, as John knows well, are tight to begin with. And I think since COVID, it's become even worse. It's become even a magnified issue. So I have not quite seen it yet, the productivity requests from our customers, but I'm sure they're going to be coming. I think they're going to give us, from what I've heard and from some of the executives I've talked to, there might be a little bit of a break here in 2020, but starting in 21, there's going to be no relief. So I think the pressure, and let's face it, depends on what proprietary technology you have, be it product or process, versus a door handle, for example, which we make a lot of, is really considered a global commodity, and therefore will get squeezed pretty tightly.
The factor that had the most impact for us in terms of supply chain strategies was the tariff wars. We tried to develop as many redundancies as we could for some very sensitive strategic components and suppliers because we were very concerned after a while about the suppliers we had in Mexico or the plants we had in Mexico and their ability to serve our plants in the US, and same issue with the components we source from China. So we tried to develop redundancies to have backup plans.
Great, thanks. As far as, you know, this changing world that's happened this year, I think we were all kind of watching the dial like January of what was going on in China. Did you guys anticipate or hear through your channels, through your plants and your partners across the globe that China was going to have as much impact beyond the Chinese New Year? We were hearing things earlier on in this year before the major storm of COVID.
Yeah,
So
certainly.
we have a,
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, we certainly saw it occur, obviously, when they shut China down at the end of January. And then we recognized that it was going to be a real problem when we tried to open our plant at the end of the, you know, when the Chinese New Year holiday was done. I believe it was February 7th, we were going to open back up, and we were prevented from opening by the Chinese government, couldn't get employees back because of the travel restrictions in China. And then we realized this was a real problem. You know, it took us another week to figure out what we had to do to comply and put those, all of those protocols in place in order to be able to operate safely in our environment. Now, I will tell you that the positive of that was it gave us a big jump on doing the same thing in the U.S. marketplace and allowed us to keep our plants open safely right through the COVID problem.
Yeah, the key thing we learned from China, which was very early in January, is that safety would be a competitive advantage. The Chinese government was very thorough in vetting the companies who could reopen their plants or their offices. They were inspecting the protocols you had in place to make sure their employees would be safe and there wouldn't be transmission in the facilities. And we actually shut most of our plants around the world down for 3 weeks to re-engineer, redesign all of our production processes, make sure that we have the safety protocols in place, screens or shower curtains between every operator in the plants. We removed all the doors, changed the food service facilities, restrooms, etc. Produced our own PPE to be ready when the crisis hit in Europe or North America.
Thanks. I was just checking in with our questions from our audience. I'd like to, John Mulder has a question for all of you. What failures have you seen in creating a global joint venture with a potential partner, one that you're currently working with? And what have you learned as things to avoid from locating a possible company to partner with?
I can go first, talk about failures. We had a few. One of them that comes to mind was the one we had in India, for example. We have our own operation now in India, our own sales organization, our own plant. But at the beginning, we had a joint venture. I think it started sometime in the 80s or 90s. And you know, one of the issues we faced is that our joint venture partner was actually our biggest competitor. So they were using the joint venture as a kind of nice to have to lead with our brand, you know, to conquer some clients who wanted the cachet of the Steelcase brand. But the reality is that they made a lot more money selling their own products directly to those clients as opposed to through the joint venture.
Yeah, we've learned the hard way in Brazil, for example. We entered a partnership with a family-owned company, did what we thought was a very thorough job of due diligence. Now, this was probably 15 years ago. 10 years into it, we found out they had a bunch of tax and labor issues. And obviously, even though we're the joint venture partner, you are also going to be held, liable also. 8 years ago, we entered a joint venture with a family-owned company that's based in Delhi, and then their manufacturing was in Pune, India. And one of our two partners wanted it more than the other two did, and we went along for the ride. It's been an acceptable joint venture, but not nearly what we thought it was going to be. We thought the sales would have doubled by now. We replaced a previous partner in there, and so here again, we went there, like I said, to satisfy General Motors, to satisfy Ford, and it hasn't quite worked out like we thought it would, but lessons learned.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we haven't done a lot of joint ventures. We actually did one in the automotive space, and that actually worked out relatively well. In the med device, we decided to do everything by going alone, but I will tell you that that may still be a mistake, particularly in China, because it's been very hard to penetrate the Chinese business, the Chinese OEMs for med device as an American company, whereas in China, we had a joint venture partner, which was Chinese, which helped us in the automotive space. And then the other thing I would say is just from I wouldn't call it a failure yet, because entrepreneurs never really see the world as failure, but maybe as pivots. But we're having to pivot in China because certainly we're looking at it. We went in with expecting it to scale up much faster than we did. And so, we've put ourselves in a position where it's going to be difficult to make money for a while in that marketplace.
Thanks. I just want to kind of call out maybe the opportunities amidst all the chaos that COVID's brought. But as you're looking at your organizations, you're doing global business, is there anything that you found through having to meet the needs of COVID that will change your long-term international approach to doing business? AKA maybe travel or working with teams across the globe, or how you sell into markets and support. I'm just kind of curious if you've got some advantage point of this worked really well and maybe we won't change back to their old ways because of maybe efficiencies or something.
I think most companies have learned, through Microsoft Teams, through Zoom, you don't necessarily have to be there. I think, everybody expects to see something different in 21, but it's not going to be the old, it's going to be the new normal. And I'm convinced virtual, be it virtual R&D, presentations, I've talked to quite a few companies in the area such as Shapecorp, GHSP, who are looking at doing things differently. If you're going to be doing them with the Japanese, Honda, you don't need to necessarily go there. There's times you're going to have to, but I think this has all taught us that we can virtually meet just like we're doing right today. But some companies have taken it quite a few steps further with their capabilities on proving out engineering capabilities, R&D capabilities. So do I like it? I wouldn't say I love it, but it's I'd much rather be face to face, but to avoid a 15-hour flight to China, that won't break my heart either.
I would agree. Yeah, go ahead,
John.
Patty. Yeah, I would agree. I think, I think through that there might be more opportunity. I mean, the cost of travel and the cost of having, let's say, an international presence is significant, and if we can do it through face-to-face over video, as opposed to having to get on a plane, as Jim says, for 15 hours to go to Asia or wherever we're traveling to, it certainly has been an impediment in order to develop the business. And so I think that there is opportunity in the ability to do it a little bit more cost effectively. But that also allows for, I think, ease of foreign competition too. So I think that's something that has that's a two-edged sword.
Yep.
I second John's and Jim's comments. What we did during the crisis is to try and push decision-making down as much as possible. So we didn't change our values, we didn't change our operating principles, but we tried to be as nimble as we could and empowered all the different geographies and organizations on the ground to make decisions as quickly as they had to respond to the latest developments of the crisis. And during the heat of the crisis, during the heat of the moment, that was a great decision, because if we had escalated all the decisions to the top, I think we would have made some mistakes, or we would have been too slow in certain occasions.
A really good point. And just checking in with our digital audience, I've got a couple of questions that have come in. One specifically to you, Eddie. What's the impact of the workplace for the long term, and how is it going to look for Steelcase?
Mm-hmm. So right now we have a lot of work from home business. So if you're not comfortable right now, if you're at home, go and visit our website. We can help. And that's been a great development of this crisis for us. We have new clients and new places to sell to. Work from home was kind of a very niche business, and it's very prevalent right now. Long term, we think the office will remain as important as it is right now. And we believe that for several reasons. The first one is because people are getting exhausted, they're fatigued working from home. And the experience people like me have, I've grown up kids, I have a nice private office at home, I can shut my door and be very focused. And the experience our teams in New York City, LA, or other places have is that they have a spouse, they have roommates working from home as well. They have to teach their kids as they work from home. And the level of disruption and kind of cognitive overload is just taking a toll in terms of productivity and engagement, and sometimes even mental health. So we don't believe that the work from home experiment is sustainable long-term for the health of employees. And then the other thing that we learned after the great financial crisis, where some of our clients didn't want to let that crisis go to waste and created work from home programs to shed real estate costs. We helped them do so, but they all came back 2 or 3 years later saying, you know what, you got to help me bring these people back to the office now, because they saw people getting disengaged and disengaged from the culture and the work itself. They saw productivity dropping over time. And they also saw things falling through the cracks where, John was running a project, he made a decision, and he could have asked me for input because I knew something that, could help him make a better decision, but he didn't do so because we didn't bump into one another. We didn't have the opportunity to have lunch or just bump on the way to having a coffee. And, our clients saw things falling through the cracks, worse decisions or bad decisions being made. And then last but not least, what we heard those clients tell us is that, when they had middle management positions to fill, they actually realized that their talent pipeline was depleted for those roles. And they didn't really have a way to gauge somebody's leadership skills and EQ if they weren't in the office. So I think right now work from home works because we're living off of social capital that we've built in the office for decades, and that will run its course. At some point, there's no more social capital that you can consume, and decisions will be slower or worse than they could if people were in the office. I think innovation will be diminished because the ability to trust one another and take risks together is a lot easier when you have a chance to break bread and build intimacy as a team, as opposed to working through the screens.
And I think that diversity of thought to contribute to that innovation. And again, you've seen it in your work teams, they feed off of each other, even if they're
That's right.
asking a question, that good cop, bad cop kind of scenario. Checking back in with some of the questions that have come in. Tim Liang would like to ask a follow-up question to our earlier conversation on JVs. So based on the panel's collective experiences, what are some of the key success factors for developing a truly successful joint venture? And then what do you believe a wholly owned subsidiary in a foreign market provides a superior business model? Can you take a look at that wholly owned subsidiary, if I can talk today, and how does that work for your company?
So in China, what we did in the automotive business is we actually had two plants right next to each other. One was a joint venture with actually the Wuxi municipal government. So it was a state-owned, an entity owned by the Wuxi municipal government. So it was a state-owned enterprise. And we did that business with one customer in that JV. And then we did the lion's share of our business with all of our other customers out of a wholly owned entity right next door. And obviously we didn't want to give access to a potential competitor, which they could be competitive, particularly after we were teaching them the technology that we used in the business, by having them be able to sell to our other customers. So that worked for us really well as a good bifurcation, because we got all of the benefits of, the guanxi that you get from having the connections in China, and without, certainly giving up the profitability and some of the innovation that we have, for individual customers. So, that's just how we experienced it.
Sonja, I think that one of the most important things is cultural fit. I don't care if it's between, obviously there's going to be differences, right, between Chinese and US, Americans, et cetera. But I think deep down, though, is there a cultural fit? Can you trust your partner, whether it's a joint venture or whatever the case is? But in India, I think that led to some of our difficulties, some cultural fits there. But I think in China, we're wholly owned entities. And we actually have a Chinese leader there who we trust implicitly. A lot of American companies will implement an American there, much like what Honda, Toyota, et cetera, does over here. But I think cultural and just a very similar mindset is very important in foreign countries.
Yeah, I believe joint ventures are a journey, not a destination. I think joint ventures work if you know what the end game is, where you want to end up in that market. At the end of the day, you probably want to end up as a wholly owned subsidiary. And so you got to understand how the joint venture is going to resolve itself and what that game plan is. In places where we had that game plan, it worked extremely well. And we moved from joint venture to wholly owned, and that transition was successful. In places where we actually didn't map out what the journey and that endpoint would be, the joint venture was not that successful, because I think inherently joint ventures are not a stable construct. They will have to move one way or the other.
Really good point. Check in with our audience. Another question. So all of you are involved in international trade. So what would you say that you've changed to continue your business growing internationally, given the current environment? So what have you had to adjust to and pivot?
Well, certainly the ability to get on a plane, quote unquote, and go travel has certainly changed. And so, trying to figure out how do you maintain a relationship with someone, and certainly the Zoom and Team have been a very valuable tools for the time, because I don't know how we would have done that without that benefit. Our general manager, for instance, is a Chinese American. She's worked for us for 15 or 20 years, and she got her citizenship to the U.S. During her employment with us. And because of that, she was not allowed to stay in the city of Suzhou because she's an American. So she had to leave. And so she has actually run the facility in China from her office here. Now she's working opposite the rest of the time because they're 12 hours different, but she's been able to, maintain, the the operations as they were without being actually in the place. I mean, she's on the, the computer on Zoom calls and et cetera, 4 or 5 hours, what our night is, but she's able to do it and maintain the business.
That's amazing. So Sonja, I think the crisis that we just went through and that we're still going through made us stronger as a global organization and culture, because in the past, all the different trends and factors influencing issues that each market had to deal with were different from one market to the next. I think it's the first time in our history that every single market, every single client had exactly the same issue. And we could truly use our scale to develop the right solutions for all of our clients around the world and leverage that at the same time across all markets. And that was unique. It never happened to us before. I think it made a tighter culture as a result of it around the world.
Yeah, I think, Eddie, I can echo that too. Our global partnership, the privately held company in Germany and Stratec over in Milwaukee, I think our communication today is as strong as it's ever been, because I think when you're on a Zoom, a Microsoft team, and you're on an important subject that you have a vested interest in, I think your listening skills, or at least I found my listening skills to be a hell of a lot better than they've ever been versus the face-to-face environment. So I still, like John said, I still would prefer face-to-face. We had a meeting this morning of our global partnership talking about a grand opening of a plant in China in later March. And I said, boy, you're pretty aggressive there. I said, we may have to have a virtual plant opening because it's been delayed now for 1.5 years. But I think, there's a lot of people still clamoring to get back face-to-face, especially us with our partnerships. And, but I agree. This has led to a lot of companies becoming stronger because of COVID-19.
And I'm sure that you're all seeing some savings on the budget side of the operation of less travel. So that'll be interesting to see how that weighs out too. And you have to find that, I think, that right balance, don't you, as far as that, personal commitment and connectivity. I think there's something that we get looking across the table and seeing eye to eye and doing that. And again, for the short term, maybe the next year until we get things settled down on COVID, hopefully shorter than longer distance, but really develop those relationships and to make sure that they know that you're committed to that market long term.
I still try to make quarterly, I still try to call every executive director at, Ford, GM that we deal with, Fiat, Chrysler, Honda, and Volkswagen, at least quarterly. Now, and I may not even have a specific topic to call about. I'm just calling in to check in and, just try to keep the relationship strong.
And that's a really good point, because I think they need to know that you're there for the long term, not for, a need. And I'm kind of curious from your operational perspective, 2018, 2 years ago, the additional tariffs, the tariff war went into place. Were you able to work with either your partners across the ocean or your customers to mitigate that and maybe split that cost, or were you able to pass that through? How did you approach some of those additional tariffs that are still in effect today?
Yeah, for us, we were able to pass the cost on for now. But I think the metals tariffs are long-term really damaging for our business because, and although material isn't a huge part of our cost, I mean, we have a lot more value added to the product. But still, if you start off with a 25% cost disadvantage on one of your primary inputs, that hurts your ability to be competitive on a global basis where people don't have that same impediment. So I think this is something we have to fix. I'm all about free and fair trade, and we can all talk about whether this was necessary or not, et cetera. But I think that for people who use steel and in their manufacturing processes, which is a lot of our manufacturing community, this has been a heightened disadvantage for American businesses.
Yeah, and Sonja, price based on market realities. It's not because, there's a trade war that's disproportionately affecting your North American production sites that you can raise prices in Germany or France for that matter. You need to look at the market realities, and if you cannot compete anymore with your cost base, you need to move your supply chain. You can't just pass on costs to the market if the market cannot bear them.
Yeah, we build the majority of our tools in China. And as John said, we were able to pass that along, but that's starting to grow thin with the OEMs. And we're going to be at a fairly significant disadvantage as an American auto supplier.
So really great points on looking at kind of some of the bubblings up of the China-Hong Kong relationship and some of the more dominance of taking over China by of the Hong Kong market. Is that going to be impacting your operations or your business at all? If that, again, everything needs to be changed over to made in China that's being produced in Hong Kong. Are you guys looking at that a little more long-term or mid-term?
Yeah, there's no difference for us in that piece of it. I do think that the overall antagonism relative to the Chinese relationship today is certainly not helpful for global trade. Although we're in the med device space, and it's not lost on me that we have a very hard time. American OEMs have a very hard time getting product approved through the Chinese FDA that allows them to sell their product into China. But they'll take it as an export because they get a 24% duty on it. There's all kinds of things where we don't have free and fair trade, and I wish we'd focus more of our attention on that than some of the arguments that we might have also had. So I think we should have been going after the intellectual property theft, and which was clearly happening. But also making sure that we have free and fair trade where we don't have tariffs and they don't have tariffs.
And I was just curious if you're looking at Asia. Obviously, on the earlier slides that I showed, you can see the impact of inter-Asia trade. Have you looked at other than suppliers, looking at maybe doing some more advanced manufacturing and other parts of Asia that would feed China and maybe circumvent some of the issues with the US-China relationship?
Asia is a tough place, and maybe there's some other countries that, and I don't have personal experience with this, but I would tell you that we've looked for years at trying to establish a relationship in India, and quite frankly, some of the things that Jim talked about, the rules of playing there are not such that we as an American business can actually even comply with. To get a business license, for instance, it's very difficult to do without paying off some, government person, and we're just not going to engage in that. And so, for all the negatives you hear about China, we never found that to be the case. And so it was relatively hospitable for establishing business in that place where it's not in some of those other countries.
Yeah, we try to not be too dependent on China for very sensitive, high-value components. We have a factory in Malaysia that manufactures those components. We perceive Malaysia as a much safer bet long-term. And we have a plant in China, but we use it to serve the Chinese market.
Yeah, that's our two plants, one outside Shanghai and another one an hour and a half west of Wuhan in Jingzhou. All the things they make are primarily staying within China. And then we do utilize our JV Indian partner for some R&D activities to help our Chinese operations. So there is some good synergy there from an R&D perspective, but but not from a manufacturing standpoint.
And that's something we've heard at the Trade Center time and time again, the quality issues you have once you start venturing out a little bit, you know, depending on what you're sourcing from other Asian markets, it may not be the same quality as what, because of the heavily investment in China, you're going to see. So I'm just curious if you guys are seeing that, you know, some supplier base that you've investigated.
We don't have any quality issues with anything we do in Asia. We're very happy with what we're getting.
Yeah, I would say the same. You know, being a tier 1 automotive supplier, our supply chain folks in China are really top notch. Significantly larger group over there than we actually have here at ADAC in West Michigan.
Yeah, and I'm kind of thinking strategically too, to take advantage of our Singapore trade agreement or Korea trade agreement. You know, not only shipping back and forth to the US, but looking at Asian, the ASEAN trade agreement. So if you had a subcomponent built, let's say in Japan or Korea, and then shipped into China for finishing, maybe that could be some advantages from a supply chain strategy. Obviously, having more than one source is definitely lessen the blow with COVID and the global supply chain right now. And just interested if you guys are kind of watching how those trade within the Asian region are developing, and maybe can capitalize on that through some subcomponent or different ways you structure your supply chain throughout the globe. One area we haven't touched on yet is, you know, COVID-19. There's a lot of resources that have been out there to help kind of weather the storm. Obviously, different markets around the globe are picking up a little more quickly than they are in others. Have any of your businesses taken advantage of any of the assistance through either our federal or state agencies? And if you could talk a little bit about that and how that's helped your business out.
So we were fortunately the recipient of PPP because we're under 500 employees in total, and and that was certainly very helpful to our business, particularly on a cash flow basis, and certainly made it easier. You know, I would say we were always going to try to keep the people because they're all skilled, but you know, we don't want to have any turnover there. But it certainly made it easy from a cash flow standpoint when, you know, we're right now, I mean, we're seeing because our product is all, you know, what they call elective surgeries, although it's really delay is the electivity, I guess. It's not that you can put off a cataract surgery. If you need one, you need one. But our volumes are down substantially. In West Michigan, we're running about 50% now of what we were, let's say, earlier in the year. So, you know, we're clearly feeling that, and, you know, the ability to have the cash flow, you know, without going more into our bank is helpful from the PPP.
So we're too big to have access to PPP, but we implemented salary reductions and reduced work hours for all of our employees, and you know, having access to the CARES Act money for work-share programs was a big deal for our employees. So it definitely helped soften the blow.
Yeah, we did some very similar things, salary reductions, eliminated bonuses completely for 2020, did use the federal tax retention credit where your salaried individuals, you continue to pay their salary, their benefits, and they can take days off, furlough, you get a 50% tax credit. So we have taken advantage of that. We'll probably use somewhere between 1.2 and 1.5 million this year, or get advantage of those tax credits. So, but a lot of the things that most people, you know, have done as far as their workforce, be it whether salaried or hourly.
Well, and touching on financing and, you know, global business, your sales are all over the world. Are you still working in primarily in US dollars, or is that vary by market? talk a little about how you're working on structuring your sales with your partners or your direct customers around the world?
So
We typically sell in whatever local currency where the product lands. In China, it's RMB. Some countries, in Europe, it's euro. In Brazil, it's real. And that's for the product that coming out of the U.S. Obviously, when we sell to Israel, it's in dollars, but most of the time we're selling in local currency. So in some cases, we have to hedge and be careful that we don't get a mismatch between cost and the actual selling price when it's priced in that local currency.
yeah, we price local, except in markets that are extremely volatile. In those markets, we price in US dollars. But they're few and far between.
Yeah. Jim, about the same?
Yeah, pretty much the same. I mean, obviously for ADAC, 98% of our sales stay right here in the US. So other than that, it's in the local market currency.
Yep. Thanks for that. One other question is, as we're looking at the global marketplace and from the data that we see, 90 to 95% of the world's customers are located outside the US. How are you looking at different marketplaces and how you would sell into those markets? Are you looking at different markets right now that you maybe did not look at 3-5 years ago because those nations are developing and they now can afford your products and services? Or Jim, in your case, your customers are there and demanding a presence there?
Yeah, we're looking heavier right now at Brazil and looking at a potential partner down there. So here again, it's always an interesting story when you're looking at a new partner, but we seem to have found a partner who shares a lot of the same common visions. He's in his mid-50s. He doesn't have a succession plan. He's looking for, and this is not ADAC, but the vast, our global partners now. But we have a very similar mindset and how we deal with a lot of different things. We've known him now for over 3 years. COVID obviously put a stop on a lot of that. But we aren't looking at new markets today than what we were already in. So other than the fact, as I mentioned already about India, but we're in all the markets we really want to be right now and have our hands full with the ones we're in right now. So.
Yeah, we look at two factors. COVID obviously is a big factor. If a country has not gotten COVID under control, that's a huge cloud on the horizon because there's no guarantee that there's a flip the switch vaccine solution. And even if there's a vaccine, it could potentially not have the efficacy that you would want to have or the adoption that you would want to have. So in places where COVID is still out of control, we probably would not invest right now. And then we look at places where the trade war could create beneficiaries somewhere else. So the trade war between US and China could be a great thing for Vietnam, could be a great thing for Germany as well. So those are the two factors we take into account.
Well, I think that kind of wipes up. I'm looking for any more questions that may have come in from our audience. I think we're almost at that closing point. So one quick question for you, Eddie, with this COVID, kind of the silver lining, is there any opportunity that Steelcase has seen in some direct commerce to the home consumer expanding? I know I'm fighting with my husband for the office space when we're working from home, but has that impacted sales at all in the consumer market for Steelcase?
Oh, in a big way. I mean, it's multiples of what it was before. It was a very small market. People didn't tend to spend money on their home office. And that changed definitely over the last 3 months.
Yeah. And then just looking at talent overall, before COVID, you still were fighting for talent. I think it's something that's going to be ongoing. And I almost think you now have another competitor in I think it just closed, on the 15th, the federal assistance for unemployment. So hopefully, you're able to keep your talent and work with them in this flex time. I know it's a nice time of year to be off, but as you're working with your relationships around the world, hopefully you're able to capitalize on that and use the tools that we have available to keep that talent pipeline engaged. I think you've touched on a lot of great things, and I think at this point, we'll turn things back over to Birgit to close things up for us.
Thank you, Sonja, and thank you to John, Eddie, and Jim. And I've been listening intently, and I'm also reflecting on what a great panel, all four of you, and what great companies we are fortunate to have in West Michigan. I mean, three world-class companies in three different industries. And sometimes I think we forget how very fortunate we are to have companies of your caliber and magnitude providing great jobs in West Michigan. So not only thank you for being on the panel, but thank you for being West Michigan businesses. So to our audience, thank you for participating. And the presentation was recorded and will be posted on our website, and the link will be sent to every participant. So please share with as many as you can, because we want to obviously spread the knowledge that was shared with us today with as many as possible. And we will be hosting another one of these webinars in August, and we look forward to having you participate again. So thanks very much to everybody, and enjoy the rest of July.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for the opportunity.